I'm not quite sure how to even start this story. A lot of things I've experienced never really fits in the subreddit's guidelines until yesterday, when this story wormed its way into my head again. This story happened when I started at a new school in the middle of 6th grade. I'm 19 now. This was technically my first middle school, and for so many reasons I transferred out. This definitely didn't help. About halfway through, I switched into Spanish to finish out the year. I had almost always had a foreign language class, so I thought it would be a pretty easy grade to end with. There was a lot of buzz surrounding the Spanish teacher, Mr. D, and when I first saw him and how he acted, I thought I could tell why. He was a pretty eccentric guy who, if you only heard his voice and weren't looking at his stern face, you would think he was pretty jovial. He almost always pronounced our names wrong, and he had this gigantic windmill on wheels in the corner of his room. The windmill reminded me that I actually heard about this teacher from an older boy called Jay in my Sunday school class. I remember telling him I was going to a school. My mom and I had ran away in the middle of my 6th grade year, and I would start a new school after Christmas break ended. It was nice to know I had at least a couple people that I knew, so I asked them to tell me about the school, or if they had any advice. Jay told me that if I ever got Mr. D, to transfer out immediately. It sounded a bit dramatic, but as we got more acquainted with Mr. D, so too did he get more acquainted with us. One thing that always made us uncomfortable was how he would rub chapstick on his lips very aggressively for like a minute, which was definitely made worse when he'd stand with one leg resting on something and his crotch leaning forward. Sure, it's pretty uncomfortable, but not the worst thing in the world. Just a bit odd. Have you ever seen a woman with her boobs rested on a desk? Sometimes it's on purpose, and sometimes it's on accident, especially when you're short and sitting down. Mr. D started doing this, but with his dick. He'd stand close to the desk to look at our work, but his bulge would be laying on their desk. He wasn't desk dick height either, so he had to stretch a little to do it. But given how strange he already seemed to be, I brushed it off as him not being self-aware. I just feel bad for the first row. Flash forward, all of his little idiosyncrasies seemed to be more prominent as the days marched on. I remember once he even answered his phone and carried on a conversation for a bit before stepping out of class. A side note, he wasn't a great teacher. He wasn't even a good teacher. English obviously wasn't his first language, which was fine. But he was there to teach Spanish. Unfortunately, he didn't speak Spanish either. He always tried to use the school PC to pull up Spanish videos on YouTube for us to mindlessly stare at on his personal laptop. Like I said, a pretty easy class. I just feel bad for the other students who didn't already know certain things when the test came. We walked in one day, and on my desk and the desk in front of mine, there were semi-straight lines of off-white liquid. It was mainly on my desk and thinned across the chair and the desk in front. Mr. D came over, not quite fast enough, as the kid began to ask me what it was. All we got was nothing, as he very quickly wiped away with his hands and rubbed it on his pants. He couldn't say it was water because it wasn't clear. It really only looked like one thing, but there wasn't any way to definitely prove it was. I tucked my hands in my sleeves and did my best not to touch my desk. A few weeks after that, I came into my English class I had at the end of the day to hear one of the girls having a pretty loud argument with our English teacher. I walked in at the middle, but the girl, Megan, was extremely upset and asking why she shouldn't go to the principal. Megan was a bit of a hothead, sure, but she was still a really nice girl. I couldn't see her dramatizing a situation this much. I found out what happened from my best friend at the time, who was in Mr. D's class when it went down. Their class was ahead of us, so their test was scheduled for that day. After papers were passed out, Mr. D went back to zoning out on his laptop until Megan needed to ask a question. She had her hand up for ages and he never noticed her, so she went over to where he was and freaked out at him. He was watching porn with the sound off on his laptop that he always brings with him and gave all his attention to. So when I came in, Megan was being reprimanded for being pretty verbal with Mr. D. Our teacher was basically telling her she shouldn't have been upset with the teacher watching porn in class, and that that's his laptop, as if that nullifies anything. Looking back, it explains so much of his shifty behavior: the desk dick rest, the hardcore stares, the personal laptop all the time, and the definite cum on our desks. It wasn't the first time he had done it, and it wouldn't have been the last time if he hadn't got suspended for the rest of the month. Mr. D disappeared, and we had a sub to finish out the rest of the school year with us. I got the fuck out of that school after everything that happened, but still keep in touch with a couple of friends who went. They told me that Mr. D was back for a while as the gym teacher and co-soccer coach, and the next year taught English. I really want to say it surprises me that he was brought back, even without knowing about anything he teaches. In hindsight, that school was atrocious. I have so many memories of bad shit students and teachers alike did. Another teacher was also given suspension for actively looking down girls' shirts and up girls' skirts when they bent over. It's just concerning to know Mr. D still works there. I've had a lot worse shit happen to me, and I still suppress this memory for ages. So teacher, who came on my desk and definitely scarred some kids for life, let's not meet. Ms. M, it's been about 12 years or so now. I know you don't work there anymore, thankfully. I don't know what could have possessed an adult woman, 50 years old no less, to torment and torture a child to their breaking point. Maybe you're just a miserable old bitch, or was a loser in school, so you targeted other losers to bring yourself up. But how you treated me, and evidently others, was not only unprofessional, but very cruel and damaging. I was a good student before. Ms. M had my family members in years prior. Unlike me, my cousins and siblings are rowdy and can be a handful. She had words with my family before, so when I came along, I was a symbol of my family, which she would take out her anger upon. I was meek and obedient, a perfect target. Ms. M would humiliate me any chance she could get. She would bring me in the front of class, call me stupid, idiot, ugly, pointed out when my legs weren't shaved, told me I looked like a boy. Mind you, I had long hair and stuff, just didn't wear makeup at that age. You would talk to me very slowly if I asked any questions, talk to me like an actual dog, bad girl, go fetch, beg, etc. Told me I smelled bad. The list goes on and on. She would sometimes aggressively pat me on the head and shout, "Good girl," when I completed one of her dog commands. She would actively encourage the other kids to make fun of me as well, and further isolated me from everyone. I started to fear any interaction with her. I feared my classmates as well. A boy in my class was being relentless and made me cry one day, so I retaliated and threw a pencil at him. I was berated heavily and treated even worse after that. So I learned to shut down and take it all. My grades slipped. I cried every day at home. I kept most of it to myself, which Miss M probably knew I would, which is why she went so hard on me. My parents did try to get my class switched, but the school refused. Not only did Miss M act like an angel around other adults, but the other classes were apparently packed to capacity, so I couldn't switch. But I also think my parents didn't try very hard. The teacher conferences made things worse each time. She'd be alright for a day or two, but the hammer would come down harder. I had to keep all the torment inside to survive. She made fresh hot chocolates for the class the day before Christmas break. When she gave me mine, I was scared and accidentally knocked it all over myself. Always was a clumsy kid. Instead of being concerned in the slightest, because it was literally scalding hot, she just let out a flurry of screams and threatened that I had better get it cleaned up quickly and spotless, or she would make me sorry. I did as I was told and ignored the searing pain in my foot. I was not allowed to call to get a change of clothes, and I was the only one not allowed to have more. The pain in my foot stabbed literally every second. It didn't let up all day, but I was so terrified, I said nothing and didn't shed a single tear, though it hurt like hell. When I got home and pulled off my sock, my skin came off with it from the burn. My mother was livid and finally stood up for me. After Christmas break, Ms. M was overly sugary to me. "Why didn't you tell me about your foot, sweetie?" And was overly accommodating. It scared me. I thought it was a trap. To my surprise, it lasted about 2 weeks. Must have had her ass handed to her. She wasn't as bad as before, but still sought to crush my spirit. On the last day of school, she refused to let me take any pictures of her. I wanted one to burn. She was very grouchy that day towards me, almost acting defeated. Although my grades were bad, I skimmed by and was moving to middle school. Her dog was off its leash, and she was powerless to keep her toy. She was hoping I'd fail. After 6th grade, I stopped caring about school. I failed a year, barely skirted by others. Landed in the dropout prevention program in high school. I had few friends, none of which I still have. I found it hard to trust teachers or authority figures anymore. I never made scenes or anything. I just sat there quiet and did nothing. Before I actually tried, actually cared. I had teachers' disappointment in me because of how well I performed in math and on tests. I never had test anxiety, and they wanted me in the mathletes one year. But I just didn't care, which I attribute, at least in part, to Ms. M. She changed my life, for the worse. The psychological damage Miss M did to me cut deep. It's hard to convey in a brief post what it was like every day for that whole year. She tore down what confidence I had. She made me afraid to trust anyone. She made me believe I was worthless. She made me feel every insult and criticism to the bone. She made me close into myself and learn to take abuse. She made me believe I was completely alone and had nobody in my corner. I was stupid, ugly, worthless, not even human. The kids from my school that came with me reinforced it as well. They also believed I was just a dumb dog and treated me as such. She dug her claws in deep, and the scars still remain. I have tried to grow past it, but it's a hard thing to overcome. So to you, Ms. M, you're not a teacher. You're an abusive psychopath who used her powers of authority to tear down and relentlessly torture a child. I hated you then, but as an adult, I just feel sorry for you. I don't know what could possibly go through an adult's mind that would make them see a vulnerable little girl as a target for sick games. Maybe you saw yourself in me and hate yourself, since we were both kind of outcasts. So you desperately tore me down and encouraged others so you could finally feel like you belonged, even if it was a bunch of children. Either way, I'm glad you were finally removed years later, and I hope your stain on the world is soon wiped clean. I hope that others you did this to, which is why you got removed, live happy lives without having you as even a passing thought. We are not weak, and do not deserve to be held as your victims. You did teach us that there are bad people out there. We may have struggled from it, but we pushed on. Hopefully none of us will ever meet you again.
One of the creepiest events in my own experience that I can recall happened when I was about 9 years old, late 1978 or early 1979 if I am not mistaken, which would have put me in the 4th grade at the time. Just a bit of background information on my school here. It was a newer school for my district at the time, and I guess as an experiment in innovative architecture, the school had no square angles in the walls at all. Rather, for simplicity's sake, imagine a U shape where the opening of the U faces onto the parking lot, but where there were hexagons attached to the outer edge of the U. Each of those hexagons was called a pod, and each pod was divided into 6 classrooms and one central area for that pod, from which a person could see into any of the 6 classrooms at one time. The playground was the entire area outside the U-shaped collection of pods, first being blacktop and then, further out, grassy field. Critically, this meant that if you were very close to the pods, it was possible for someone else, also close to the pods, to be within 20 feet of you and still be hidden around the bend of the wall. So on this day in 1978 or 1979, my school had open house or parent-teacher conferences. This is when parents were welcome to come to the school and talk with one another, especially with their children's teachers, and to see how their child or children were performing in the school. My mom never missed one of these, and this day was no exception. We went to the school and saw all the teachers and kids and parents gathered in the cafeteria. After whatever general address the principal had to make, everyone went their separate ways to meet one-on-one. My mom had teachers to meet for 2 children, for me and my older brother, who was 1 year ahead of me. When we met my teacher, Mrs. Holbrook, my mom brought me and my brother into the classroom. She apparently had good things to say about me, and we were done quickly. But when we met my older brother's teacher, Mr. Covey, for some reason my mom told me to go out on the playground and play. My brother remained in the classroom with my mom and his teacher. It was still light outside, so all seemed okay. However, by this time an hour or more had probably passed since the principal's speech ended. Any parents who attended for that only, or who only wanted to meet a single teacher briefly, had done so by now and left. The playground area was devoid of people. Naive little boy that I was, I just walked around the pods like I was in my own house, and I stayed close to the outer wall of the pods for no real reason. All of a sudden, without hearing or seeing anything to prepare me for what was about to happen, I was pinched across the back of the neck very hard. The hand that held me seemed too strong for me to break away, and I didn't even have time to try before a voice whispered in my ear to stay still and not turn around. I nodded as best as I could. Then the voice told me to walk, and it led me around the pod to within sight of the parking lot where a few cars remained. The voice asked me if I saw the green car, the station wagon with wooden paneling on it. I did and indicated so. The voice told me, "Walk to that car, get inside and wait there. Do not turn around. I will be right behind you, and if you turn around, I will know you did. Do you understand me?" All the while the owner of the hand and of the harsh whisper squeezed my neck harder at intervals to add emphasis to certain points. The person then sent me walking to that car. I think I know how the condemned dead man walking must feel. I was a naive boy, but not so naive as to believe getting in that car was a good idea. On the other hand, I felt sure that turning around was death if the owner of that voice was still really there. I had gotten halfway to the car when I wound up freezing, unsure what to do. I just stood there crying, which was already an improvement over the extraordinary fear that preceded it. I don't know if I stood there seconds or minutes, but eventually I turned around. Nobody was there. I figured they were back around the pod, peeking, waiting, but my mom was that direction also, so I swung way out into the playground area and walked carefully back around. Somewhere near where I was originally pinched were 2 boys a year ahead of me, my older brother's age, playing marbles, Roger and another boy whose name I never knew. I avoided them, feeling sure they, Roger particularly, were probably the ones who had pinched me, but I am sure at some point they noticed me passing them at a distance. They did not react at all. In fact, my brother talked about Roger much later by chance in terms that caused me to believe he was a nice guy. Probably as importantly, later reflection led me to consider the whispered voice and the powerful hand to most likely have belonged to an adult male, not to a fellow child. But why did that fool want me in Mr. Covey's car? Mr. Covey was in a conference with my mom, so it was not his doing. My only other guess was my 3rd grade teacher, Dr. Schofield, who had once grabbed me violently when I got up from my chair in class without permission while he was in a bad mood. That dude was eventually arrested in 1980 on suspicion of having molested 4 boys earlier the same year, a year after my traumatic experience on the playground. I'll never know for sure, but I will always wonder who it was.